is a dangerous idea that has seeped into the minds of far too many people, and it is one that keeps them trapped in patterns of self-betrayal and quiet suffering. It is the belief that being nice is the highest virtue, that being agreeable is the same as being good, that to be worthy of love and respect, one must always be accommodating, always pleasant, always willing to bend and adjust to the needs of others. But that belief is deeply flawed, and worse, it is destructive. It does not lead to happiness. It does not lead to a meaningful life. It leads only to resentment, exhaustion, and a slow erosion of the self. Niceness is often mistaken for morality, but the two are not the same. Niceness is an outward display, an attempt to smooth interactions, to avoid confrontation, to make others comfortable. It is not an expression of deep integrity. It is not a reliable compass for making the right choices. It is more often than not a survival mechanism, a way to move through the world without drawing too much negative attention, without causing disruption, without making enemies. But a person who is merely nice without the strength to back it up is not a person who will change the world. The truly virtuous person is not just nice. They are honest. They are courageous. They are willing to stand their ground when necessary, even if it means making others uncomfortable. They are not agreeable for the sake of being agreeable. They do not sacrifice what is right simply to keep the peace. They recognize that peace built on suppression and self-denial is not peace at all. It is a slow kind of suffering, a gradual decay of one's own integrity. And here is the real danger. When a person lives their life being nothing more than nice, when they say yes when they mean no, when they smile when they are filled with frustration, when they allow others to take advantage of their kindness without protest, they do not remain truly kind. They do not remain selfless. They do not remain good. Instead, they begin to accumulate resentment. And resentment is a poison. It builds in small increments, so slowly at first that it is hardly noticeable. But over time it grows, it festers. It turns what was once a simple habit of self-sacrifice into a deep-seated bitterness. It turns a person who once gave freely into someone who feels drained, used, and unseen. The path away from this kind of slow destruction is not to become cruel or selfish. That is not the answer. The answer is to stop equating agreeableness with virtue. The answer is to recognize that real morality, real integrity requires something much harder than just being nice. It requires being strong. It requires knowing when to say no. It requires being willing to disappoint people. It requires understanding that conflict is sometimes necessary, that boundaries are essential, and that the only way to truly be good is to refuse to let yourself become a doormat in the name of kindness. And this is difficult. It is difficult because the world rewards those who make themselves easy to deal with. It praises those who do not challenge the status quo, who do not speak up, who do not demand more. But a person who is only ever easy to deal with is not a person who will build anything meaningful. They will not fight for what is right. They will not stand up against injustice. They will not carve out a life that is truly their own. Instead, they will be carried along by the expectations of others, by the demands of a world that does not care about their well-being as much as they might like to believe. And so the task then is to cultivate a different kind of character. It is to be someone who is not just nice, but who is also wise, who is discerning, who knows when kindness is required and when a firm hand is necessary, who understands that being respected is more important than being liked, that speaking the truth is more valuable than pleasing everyone, that sometimes the most moral thing you can do is stand your ground, even if it makes you unpopular. This does not mean becoming cold or cruel. It does not mean rejecting kindness altogether. It means integrating kindness with strength. It means recognizing that to be truly good, one must be willing to act in ways that are sometimes difficult. One must be willing to step into uncomfortable conversations. One must be willing to risk the disapproval of others, because a life spent only in pursuit of approval is not a life lived authentically. It is a life spent in quiet submission, a life that will eventually lead to regret. So if you have spent years believing that your worth is tied to your ability to be nice, if you have been bending and accommodating and suppressing your own needs for the sake of keeping the peace, then it is time to let go of that illusion. It is time to step into something more powerful. It is time to learn that true goodness is not passivity. It is not endless agreeableness. It is not the absence of conflict. It is the willingness to stand firm, to be honest, to live with integrity, even when it is difficult. Because at the end of your life, when you look back on the choices you made, you will not wish that you had been more agreeable. You will not wish that you had sacrificed yourself more for the comfort of others. You will wish that you had spoken up. You will wish that you had been bolder. You will wish that you had lived on your own terms rather than allowing the expectations of the world to dictate your every move. So stop being just nice, start being real, start being strong, and start living in a way that you will never have to regret. There is a great misunderstanding about the nature of kindness, and it is one that has left far too many people, especially those who are naturally agreeable, vulnerable to exploitation, exhaustion, and deep dissatisfaction. It is the belief that being good means never saying no, that being compassionate means always putting others first, that being likable is more important than being honest. But this belief, though often reinforced by society, is a dangerous one. It does not lead to a life of purpose or fulfillment. It does not lead to genuine respect or meaningful relationships. It leads instead to frustration, to burnout, and to the quiet realization that by trying to make everyone happy, you have made yourself deeply unhappy. Many people are raised with the idea that their role is to accommodate, to be easygoing, to keep the peace, to ensure that others are comfortable, even at their own expense. And while there is value in cooperation, while there is wisdom in diplomacy, there is also a fine line between being thoughtful and becoming a person who is taken for granted. A person who always yields, who always prioritizes others, who never asserts their own needs, may think they are being kind, but in reality, they are erasing themselves bit by bit. The real issue is that excessive agreeableness often masks something else entirely. It can be a defense mechanism, a way of avoiding conflict, a strategy for gaining approval. If you always say yes, if you never cause trouble, if you never demand more, then you avoid risk. You ensure that others see you as pleasant, as accommodating, as someone who is easy to get along with. But at what cost? If you live your life afraid to upset others, afraid to ask for what you need, afraid to push back when something is wrong, then you are not really living on your own terms. You are living in a way that is dictated by fear, fear of rejection, fear of disapproval, fear of standing alone. The problem is that people who habitually put others before themselves believe they are being selfless. But self-sacrifice without boundaries is not a virtue. It is a slow form of self-destruction. If you give endlessly without regard for your own needs, you do not become a saint. You become resentful. And resentment is corrosive. It builds gradually, quietly, until one day you find yourself exhausted, bitter, wondering why no one appreciates all that you have done, why no one seems to return the same care and consideration that you have always offered. But the truth is, if you have trained people to expect that you will always say yes, that you will always yield, that you will always be there no matter how little they reciprocate, then they will take it for granted. Not because they are necessarily malicious, but because people tend to take what is freely given without question. If you want to be truly respected, if you want to build relationships that are built on mutual understanding rather than quiet resentment, then you have to learn to say no. You have to stop apologizing for having limits. You have to stop believing that prioritizing your own well-being is somehow selfish. It is not selfish to refuse to be treated as an afterthought. It is not selfish to walk away from those who only value you when you are making their lives easier. It is not selfish to stand up for yourself when necessary. People who are too agreeable often think that being difficult, standing their ground, or voicing their true thoughts will make them unlikable. But this is not true. If anything, being honest, being firm, being willing to assert yourself will make you more respected. Because people do not truly admire those who always bend. They admire those who stand tall. They admire those who have conviction, who do not compromise their principles just to gain approval. There will be moments when you will have to choose between being liked and being true to yourself. And that is a hard decision, especially for those who have spent their lives believing that their worth is tied to how much they can please others. But being truly good, truly strong, requires the willingness to be disliked when necessary. It requires the courage to accept that not everyone will approve of you, and that is okay, because the respect that comes from authenticity is far more valuable than the shallow approval that comes from people-pleasing. This does not mean becoming rude, harsh, or unkind. It does not mean rejecting cooperation or disregarding the feelings of others. It means understanding that real kindness is not about being a doormat. Real kindness includes self-respect. It includes the ability to set boundaries. It includes the wisdom to know when giving is noble and when it is simply enabling others to take advantage of you. If you have spent your life believing that your role is to be endlessly accommodating, if you have felt the weight of always having to make others comfortable at the cost of your own happiness, then it is time to step out of that mindset. It is time to recognize that your worth is not determined by how easy you make life for others. It is time to stop betraying yourself in the name of keeping the peace. Because the peace that comes from constant self-sacrifice is not real peace. It is simply a delay of inevitable exhaustion and disillusionment. So take a step back and ask yourself, are you living in a way that honors your own needs? Are you being honest about what you truly want? Are you making decisions based on your own convictions? Or are you simply trying to avoid upsetting others? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. Because the moment you start prioritizing truth over blind agreeableness, the moment you stop living for the approval of others, the moment you stand up for yourself without apology, that is the moment you begin to truly live. There is a deeply ingrained belief that has shaped the lives of too many people, and it is this: that in order to be loved, accepted, and valued, one must always be pleasant, always accommodating, always agreeable. It is a belief that tells people, especially those who are naturally kind and empathetic, that their worth is measured by how much they can do for others, by how little space they take up, by how well they can avoid conflict. But this belief is not a recipe for a meaningful life. It does not lead to deep fulfillment or genuine relationships built on mutual respect. Instead, it leads to exhaustion, to bitterness, to a gradual erasure of the self. The reality is that a life built on endless people-pleasing is not sustainable. It creates a situation in which one is constantly overextending, constantly sacrificing their own needs, constantly prioritizing others at the expense of their own well-being. And over time, this does not lead to happiness, it leads to resentment. It leads to the slow realization that by always putting others first, by never asserting their own needs, by constantly striving to be easy to deal with, they have made themselves invisible. They have trained people to take them for granted. A person who is always agreeable may believe they are making life easier for everyone around them. And in the short term, this may be true, but in the long term, they are doing themselves and others a great disservice. Because true relationships built on trust and respect require honesty. They require the ability to say no. They require the courage to voice discomfort, to set boundaries, to demand fair treatment. If a person is always yielding, always accommodating, always avoiding conflict, then they are not truly engaging in their relationships. They are merely performing a role designed to keep the peace, to avoid rejection, to ensure that they are liked. But being liked is not the same as being valued. And this is where the real problem lies. If a person spends their entire life trying to be liked, trying to be agreeable, trying to avoid ever being a source of discomfort for anyone, then they are not living authentically. They are not making choices based on what is right or what is best for them. They are making choices based on fear. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of being seen as difficult. Fear of losing approval. But a life lived in fear is not a life lived fully. It is a life of quiet constraint, of endless self-monitoring, of making oneself smaller and smaller in the hope that doing so will bring security. But security does not come from endless compliance. It does not come from suppressing one's true thoughts and feelings. It does not come from living in a way that prioritizes external approval over internal truth. In fact, the more a person sacrifices their own voice, their own needs, their own well-being for the sake of keeping others happy, the less happy they will ultimately be. It is a painful realization to come to, but it is also a necessary one, because there is another way. There is a way to live that does not require constant self-sacrifice, a way to engage with others that does not demand endless suppression of one's own needs. And that way is through honesty, through strength, through a willingness to risk disapproval in exchange for self-respect. Being able to stand up for oneself, to say no when necessary, to set limits with those who overstep. These are not acts of cruelty. They are acts of self-preservation. They are acts of wisdom. Because a person who respects themselves will attract respect from others. A person who is willing to assert their own needs will create relationships that are balanced and fair. A person who values their own time, energy, and dignity will not allow themselves to be taken advantage of. And this is not about becoming selfish or unkind. It is not about disregarding the feelings of others. It is about understanding that true kindness cannot exist without self-respect. That real generosity is not the result of endless self-sacrifice, but of a willingness to give freely without resentment, without expectation, without the quiet bitterness that comes from constantly giving more than one receives. The truth is that no one benefits from a person who is endlessly accommodating at their own expense. Those who take advantage of that kind of kindness will continue to do so. And those who genuinely care will feel an underlying tension, an unspoken frustration, a sense that something is not quite right. Because something is not quite right. A person who is always saying yes when they want to say no, who is always prioritizing others while neglecting themselves, is not living with integrity. They are not being fully honest. And honesty is the foundation of all meaningful relationships. So the challenge is this: to step away from the need to be liked at all costs, to recognize that being respected is far more important than being agreeable, to understand that saying no, setting boundaries, and standing firm are not acts of aggression, they are acts of self-care. Because at the end of the day, a person's worth is not measured by how easy they are to get along with. It is not determined by how much they can accommodate, by how little trouble they cause, by how much they can suppress themselves for the sake of making others comfortable. Worth is inherent. It is not something that has to be earned through endless sacrifice. And so it is time to stop living in quiet submission. It is time to stop being afraid of conflict. It is time to stop making decisions based on the fear of disapproval. It is time to step fully into life, to stand with strength, to speak with honesty, and to embrace the reality that true fulfillment does not come from being endlessly agreeable. It comes from being authentically, unapologetically oneself. There is a dangerous illusion that has kept many people trapped in lives of frustration and quiet despair. It is the belief that if one is simply kind enough, agreeable enough, and selfless enough, the world will reward them with fairness, appreciation, and love. It is the belief that if one never makes demands, never asserts their own needs, never becomes a source of discomfort for others, then in return, life will be smooth, relationships will be harmonious, and happiness will come effortlessly. But this is not how the world works. This is not how human nature operates. And clinging to this illusion only leads to disappointment, exhaustion, and a slow erosion of self-respect. The truth is that people are not automatically rewarded for being good. Life does not hand out prizes for endless accommodation. Being agreeable does not necessarily lead to kindness in return, and sacrificing one's own needs for the sake of others does not guarantee appreciation. If anything, often has the opposite effect. When a person makes themselves perpetually available, when they say yes to everything, when they never assert their own boundaries, they do not receive more respect. They receive less. This is an uncomfortable truth, but it is one that must be understood. People do not value what is given to them without effort. They do not admire what is too easily available. They do not respect what asks for nothing in return. When a person constantly gives without question, without limit, without expectation, others, whether consciously or unconsciously, begin to see them not as an equal, but as a resource. And resources are not respected. They are used. This is why it is so crucial to establish boundaries, to develop the ability to say no, to assert one's own needs and desires without apology. Because without boundaries, a person is not truly engaging in relationships, they are merely enduring them. They are allowing others to dictate the terms of their existence, to determine their worth, to decide how much or how little they deserve. And that is not a sustainable way to live. Yet many struggle with this idea because they have been taught that setting boundaries is selfish, that saying no is rude, that asserting oneself is a form of aggression. But this is not true. Boundaries are not a rejection of others, they are an affirmation of the self. Saying no is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of self-respect. Asserting one's own needs is not a betrayal of kindness, it is a necessary condition for a balanced and healthy life. It is easy to believe that by always being agreeable, by always yielding, by always putting others first, one is maintaining harmony. But in reality, this only creates a false peace, a fragile and temporary illusion of stability. Because sooner or later, resentment begins to build. Sooner or later, exhaustion sets in. Sooner or later, the weight of constant self-sacrifice becomes too heavy to bear. And when that moment comes, when the quiet bitterness that has been growing for years finally reaches its breaking point, the result is not harmony, it is rupture. This is why it is essential to stop waiting for the world to recognize unspoken sacrifices, to stop expecting others to notice the quiet burdens carried without complaint, to stop believing that endless selflessness will somehow be rewarded in the end. Because the truth is, people are responsible for teaching others how they deserve to be treated. And if a person never demands respect, they will not receive it. If they never assert their own needs, those needs will not be met. If they never say no, others will assume they are always willing to say yes. And so the challenge is this, to move beyond the illusion that being endlessly nice will lead to fulfillment. To recognize that true kindness is not about erasing oneself for the comfort of others, but about engaging in relationships with honesty, with fairness, with mutual respect. To understand that real strength comes not from silent endurance, but from the courage to stand firm, to set limits, to demand more when necessary. Because at the end of the day, a life spent trying to please everyone is a life that belongs to no one, not even to oneself. And no one can build a meaningful, fulfilling existence on a foundation of quiet submission. There comes a moment when the choice must be made to continue living in the shadow of fear and approval seeking, or to step into a life of authenticity and salaifa. And when that moment comes, the right choice, the only choice, is to stand up, to speak up, and to stop being afraid of what happens when one finally refuses to be taken for granted. There is a common mistake that many people make, a mistake that leads them into cycles of frustration, disappointment, and even quiet resentment. It is the belief that if they are simply good enough, patient enough, and understanding enough, then others will naturally treat them with the same care and consideration. It is the belief that kindness alone will earn them respect, that self-sacrifice will be rewarded, and that avoiding conflict will somehow create peace. But this belief is deeply flawed. It is an illusion that when clung to for too long leads not to fulfillment, but to exhaustion. The world does not operate according to a simple moral equation where kindness is always reciprocated, where generosity is always appreciated, where being agreeable results in fairness. It would be nice if this were true, but it is not. In reality, people are not always fair. They do not always return the consideration they receive. They often take advantage of what is freely given. And those who do not stand up for themselves, who do not establish clear expectations for how they wish to be treated, will eventually find themselves being overlooked, undervalued, and used. This is why self-respect is more important than blind kindness. This is why having clear standards for how one allows others to treat them is not an act of selfishness, but of necessity. Because those who fail to establish boundaries, who always yield, who always accommodate, do not earn more love or admiration. They simply become more convenient. They become the person who will always say yes, who will always make excuses for others, who will always tolerate neglect, dismissiveness, or mistreatment in the name of being nice. And what happens then? People learn that they do not need to put in effort to maintain the relationship because the person who is always agreeable will always be there, regardless of how little they receive in return. This is not to say that kindness itself is a weakness. Quite the opposite. True kindness, when balanced with self-respect and strength, is one of the most powerful forces in the world. But kindness without boundaries is not kindness, it is submission. It is an abandonment of one's own worth. It is a refusal to demand fair treatment, not because one does not deserve it, but because they have been conditioned to believe that asking for it is somehow wrong. Many people struggle with this because they have been taught, explicitly or implicitly, That being liked is the most important thing. That their value is determined by how agreeable they can be. That setting boundaries will push people away. That saying no will make them difficult. That expressing their true needs will make them a burden. But the truth is, the relationships that are only sustained by constant people-pleasing are not real relationships. They are imbalanced transactions built on the unspoken understanding that one person will always give more than they receive. And this is the painful realization that must be confronted. If a relationship can only survive as one person suppresses their own needs, then that relationship is not worth preserving. If someone's affection, friendship, or approval is entirely dependent on another person never asserting themselves, never asking for more, never expressing dissatisfaction, then that is not genuine affection. That is convenience disguised as care. The fear of disappointing others, the fear of being seen as selfish, the fear of losing relationships by setting boundaries, these fears are powerful. But they must be overcome, because the cost of refusing to overcome them is far greater. The cost is a life of quiet frustration, a life in which one is constantly putting others first at the expense of their own well-being, a life in which resentment builds like a slow-burning fire that never fully goes out. No one can sustain that forever. No one can keep pouring from an empty cup. Eventually, the exhaustion will set in. The bitterness will surface. And when that happens, when the years of self-neglect finally catch up, the realization will come that trying to keep everyone happy has only resulted in making oneself deeply unhappy. But it is not too late. It is never too late to stop living under the weight of other people's expectations. It is never too late to demand better, not just from others, but from oneself, to expect more. To stop being afraid of what will happen when one finally says no. Because the people who truly care, the people who truly value and respect someone will not disappear just because that person stops being endlessly agreeable. If anything, they will respect them more. Because respect is not given to those who bend at every demand. It is given to those who stand their ground, who know their worth, who refuse to be treated as an afterthought. And so the challenge is simple, though not easy, to stop waiting for unspoken sacrifices to be acknowledged, to stop expecting fairness from those who have already shown they will not give it, to stop believing that endless patience and compliance will someday be rewarded. The real reward comes from self-respect. The real reward comes from refusing to accept less than what one deserves. And that reward is worth far more than the fleeting approval of those who only appreciate what they do not have to work for. There is a fundamental misunderstanding that leads many people into a life of quiet frustration and unmet expectations. It is the belief that if they avoid conflict, if they accommodate the needs of others without question, if they remain agreeable at all costs, then life will naturally reward them with peace, love, and respect. But this is not how the world works. Avoiding conflict does not create peace, it creates an illusion of peace. A fragile state of being where one suppresses their own needs in order to maintain an appearance of harmony. And over time, that illusion begins to crack. The belief that one must be nice above all else often stems from the fear of rejection, the fear of making others uncomfortable, the fear of losing relationships. But these fears are deceptive because they lead a person to act in ways that do not reflect their true thoughts, feelings, or desires. When someone prioritizes being nice over being honest, they do not build deep, meaningful relationships. They build relationships that are based on performance, on silence, on the constant suppression of anything that might cause even the slightest disruption. And that is not true connection, it is self-betrayal. No one is meant to move through life without asserting themselves. No one is meant to exist solely as a reflection of what others want them to be. And yet many people who strive to always be the nice person find themselves falling into exactly that role, one where their own needs are secondary, one where they minimize their own discomfort, while prioritizing the comfort of others. But what happens when that pattern continues for too long? What happens when someone never speaks up, never pushes back, never insists on their own worth? The answer is simple: they become invisible. It is not intentional, but it is inevitable. Because when someone teaches the people around them that their needs will always come second, those people stop considering those needs at all. When someone repeatedly allows others to take priority, they stop being seen as an individual with their own limits, desires, and expectations. And when they finally reach a point of exhaustion, when they finally recognize that their silence has cost them their sense of self, they look around and realize something painful. No one forced them into this role. They accepted it. They allowed it. They participated in it, thinking that if they were just good enough, patient enough, accommodating enough, then one day someone would finally see them, hear them, acknowledge them. But that day never comes, because visibility is not given, it is taken. This is why it is necessary to break free from the compulsion to always be a nice, to always be agreeable, to always put others first at the expense of one's own well-being. It is not cruelty to say no. It is not selfish to set boundaries. It is not unkind to demand respect. In fact, it is only through these actions that real kindness can exist. Because real kindness does not stem from a place of fear or obligation. It comes from strength. It comes from choice. It comes from an individual knowing their own worth and treating themselves with the same care and respect they offer to others. A person who respects themselves does not allow themselves to be overlooked. They do not wait for someone else to recognize their value, they make it known. They do not hope that one day others will treat them better, they demand better. And in doing so, they show the world that they are not simply there to accommodate, to please, to be convenient. They are a force, a presence. A person's needs matter just as much as anyone else's. But breaking free from the need to be nice at all costs is difficult. It requires unlearning years, sometimes decades of conditioning. It requires confronting the fear of disapproval, the fear of being seen as difficult, the fear of losing relationships that were built on the unspoken agreement that one person would always give more than they received. It requires stepping into discomfort, embracing the reality that not everyone will like it when they can no longer be taken for granted. But that discomfort is necessary. Because if a relationship can only survive as long as one person remains silent, compliant, endlessly giving, then it is not a relationship worth preserving. And so the question is not whether one should stop being nice. The question is whether one is willing to live in truth. Whether one is willing to exchange the false peace of constant accommodation for the real peace of self-respect. Whether one is ready to stop waiting for others to value them and instead begin valuing themselves. Because the reality is this: the world does not reward those who make themselves small. It rewards those who stand firm, who speak clearly, who refuse to disappear into the expectations of others. And at the end of the day, no one can do that for you. You must choose it for yourself. There is a belief deeply ingrained in many that if they are just pleasant enough, agreeable enough, self-sacrificing enough, then the world will naturally return the favor. That if they keep their voices soft, their opinions in check, their needs secondary, then others will reward them with kindness, respect, and love. But this is not how life works. And those who cling to this illusion find themselves disillusioned, exhausted, and deeply resentful. Because no matter how much they give, no matter how much they bend, they find that the respect and consideration they so desperately hope for never fully arrives. It is an uncomfortable truth, but it must be said: people do not reward weakness. And while being nice is often mistaken for virtue when it comes at the cost of self-respect, it is nothing more than a form of self-neglect. A person who is overly accommodating, who never sets limits, who never speaks up in their own defense, is not seen as kind. They are seen as someone who can be ignored. And over time, that is exactly what happens. This is not to say that one must be harsh, unfeeling, or cruel. Strength does not require cruelty. It does not demand a rejection of kindness, but it does require a clear sense of self, an unwillingness to be disregarded, and the ability to say no when necessary. Because the world does not change for those who passively wait to be recognized. It changes for those who demand recognition, who refuse to shrink, who take up a space without apology. And yet so many hesitate to take this step. They hesitate because they have been told that being likable is the most important thing. That conflict is to be avoided at all costs. That making others uncomfortable is a sign of failure. But what they do not realize is that avoiding conflict does not prevent problems, it creates them. Problems do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They grow in silence, taking root in every suppressed frustration, in every unspoken need, in every moment of forced compliance. And the person who refuses to assert themselves, who allows their boundaries to be crossed without protest, is not maintaining peace. They are merely postponing the inevitable collapse. This is why learning to be firm, to set limits, to say what one means without fear is not just important, it is essential. Because those who do not stand up for themselves teach others that they do not need to be considered. Those who do not demand respect show the world that they can live without it. And those who never push back allow others to believe that they will never have to. This change is not easy. It requires breaking free from years of conditioning, from the deeply held belief that being liked is more valuable than being respected. It requires learning to tolerate discomfort, to sit with the unease that comes when people react negatively to boundaries that should have been there all along. It requires risking the loss of relationships that were built on one-sided sacrifice. And yet, despite this difficulty, despite the fear, the truth remains: nothing is more exhausting than a life spent betraying oneself for the sake of pleasing others. It is time to stop waiting for others to grant permission to take up space. It is time to stop hoping that quiet sacrifices will one day be noticed and rewarded. It is time to stop believing that being agreeable will somehow protect against pain, against rejection, against disappointment. Because the truth is, life is difficult regardless. Pain will come no matter what. The difference is whether one endures it in silence or faces it with strength. And so the choice is clear. One can remain trapped in the endless cycle of trying to please, of trying to avoid conflict, of hoping that being nice will be enough to create a fulfilling life. Or one can step forward, embrace the discomfort of self-assertion, and finally claim the respect that has always been deserved. Because at the end of the day, a life spent making oneself small for the sake of others is not a life at all. It is a slow disappearance. And no one should be willing to disappear